Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 5th annual Kalpanachala Space Dialogue for 2021. My name is Daniel Porras. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications from Secure World Foundation, and I'm delighted to be here with an excellent panel of experts and speakers to give us some insight into trends in space weaponization, challenges for the Indo-Pacific region. This is, of course, a really hot topic at the moment because we are seeing current trends that there could be some arms racing or weaponizing of different types of space technologies. And we're all wondering, what does this mean for stability in outer space? What does it mean for stability here on Earth? And for larger geopolitical trends? And of course, what could be the impacts not only on military operations, but also on civilians? And so to discuss this, we've got some great speakers, some of the top minds in this field right now. I will just start from the top, the way that I see them here on my screen. First of all, we've got Professor Chandra, the JRD Tata Visiting Professor for the National Institute of Advanced Studies. I have my colleague, Ms. Victoria Samson from Secure World Foundation, Dr. Jessica West from Project Ploughshares, and of course my very dear friend and host for the Kalpanachala Dialogue, Dr. Rajeswari Rajagopalan from ORF. So folks, let's kick this off. First, Jessica, I would like you to start our conversation and just let us know, what is a space weapon? What do we mean when we talk about weaponization of outer space? And can we even define what a space weapon is?
Wow, that's a super meaty question. I'm going to take a few moments to unpack it into a few steps. The concept of space weaponization really emerges in a specific historical context where the driving concern was weapons being placed on orbit that could strike Earth. And that's terrifying and not something I think anyone in the world wants to see. And so the driving euphemism, really, space weapons is really a euphemism for space-based strike capabilities. Of course, those capabilities were not developed because there's physical limitations and moral abhorrence, I think, of that approach to warfighting. But the notion of space weaponization has continued. I think that what is tricky today is not necessarily definitions. I'm maybe one of fewer people who believes that, yes, you can define weapons in space. I think challenges related to definition are not different in space than they are in other domains of arms control. To me, what is most challenging is that what is happening in space when it comes to technology to have a weapons effect is it's far outstripped this limited concept of what a space weapon is and the issue. And so I'm going to draw an analogy to Earth. What is an Earth weapon? We don't restrict Earth weapons. We have different categories of arms control. And I think that we're reaching a point in outer space where there are potential directed energy capabilities. There's electronic interference capabilities. There are kinetic capabilities. And trying to capture all of that in a single definition of a space weapon is tricky. China and Russia have put together a definition in their draft PPWT treaty that would restrict the orbiting of weapons or the use of force in space. I think their definition works. They look at capability and intent and effects, and those are very broad definitions of weapons. The problem is too many things fall into this category, and many things that are not weapons might also fall into that category. And so I think starting to unpack this concept more and focus on specific effects and very specific capabilities would be maybe a better way forward. Thanks.
Oh, you're muted. Sorry about that. Of course I was muted. But Jessica's given us a lot of information there. Victoria, do you have a response on that specific aspect of the question?
Yeah, I think oftentimes it hasn't been a helpful conversation, frankly, to argue definitions for what a space weapon is, because I think it looks back, it harkens back to a previous time of arms control when that might have been a helpful way of looking at it. But as Jessica said, there's so many different ways in which you could develop a sort of capability that, I think it's better to look at what sort of, actions and behavior are doing. And I'll go into that a little bit more later. But I think it's been a distraction, frankly, to have these same arguments over and over again. Meanwhile, the space security picture keeps getting increasingly complicated, and we're stuck having the same discussions from 4 decades ago. Thank you.
Well, before we start digging too far into the policy aspect of it, why don't we get a little bit more of a technical overview? Professor Chandra, can you tell us a little bit about the current trends that we're seeing in weaponization, what kinds of new technologies are emerging, and what's creating the most concern for stability in outer space?
See, I think the way to look at this problem is not necessarily to focus on the end part of what we think is the application of force. We have to look at an entire value chain, which starts in a fundamental sense with the ability to locate objects from space, and then to be able to target different kinds of different kind of weapon from platforms of different kinds, which are able to kind of inflict damage on the geography or on the cyber or on the space aspect of a country's assets. So it's much more complicated than just looking at a very narrow part of what is called a space weapon. And one of the critical part of this space requirement, or the value chain or the kill chain, as many military people talk about, is the fact that you need to know what exactly you're looking for and where is it located. And one of the key requirements of space, as we have seen it emerge over the last 20, 30 years, maybe even longer than that actually, is to be able to use the space domain to be able to locate various kinds of threats that a country may want to look at, or to look at various kinds of actions it might have to take in a preemptive way in order to make sure that they are properly dealt with. And I have been looking a lot at what China has been doing, and also, in a sense, looking at it relative to the United States, which I think is the major source of potential weaponization of space as we go forward into the 21st century. So my view is that one of the key requirements is the ability to locate all kinds of objects from space, what is known as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, the ISR capability. And China has in place a constellation of satellites. Most of them are very clearly military satellites. They have in place about 40 of them, which are currently operational. They've launched about 68 of them. And they consist of 3 or 4 different kinds of satellites. They are what are called electronic intelligence satellites. There are 2 kinds of electronic intelligence satellites, one which are located at a higher orbit, which have a larger coverage. Those satellites are also able to look at and pinpoint, not pinpoint, maybe locate radio emitters on the surface, including from mobile movements like aircraft carriers. Then they have a constellation of orbiting satellites in 3 different planes, which means effectively something like 18 satellites that continuously provide surveillance, especially over the Indo-Pacific. The region of China's interest is between 35 degrees north and 35 degrees south, as we can see from this constellation. So there are 2 kinds of electronic intelligence satellites which kind of provide the cue for optical and SAR satellites to be able to more precisely locate targets of interest. So we've been doing a little bit of work on the Chinese capabilities, especially because India is also looking at some of these issues. And we have a kind of simulation model that we have run recently, and I will send the details separately by mail so that maybe you can put it up onto the discussion platform as in an appropriate place. So what we found from this simulation was that there are 18 of these what I call theater electronic intelligence satellites that China has launched. They are currently operational. There are about 12 what I call broad area triangulation kind of approach, which can locate objects on the ground, which China has also had. And they have about 10 to 12 maybe SAR and electro-optical satellites. So what we did was we took the 18 theater ELINT and the 12 location ELINT satellites and ran a simulation over Bangalore to find out what is the kind of coverage that we will get over a 24-hour period. We can also model the kind of receivers that are needed in order to locate these objects. They are not very difficult to do, very simple. We have not done anything elaborate, but just a simple coverage kind of thing. And what we found was something like over a 24-hour period, 83% of the time, or out of, I don't know, 1,240, we got a number like 1,440, we got a number like 1,240 minutes when Bangalore, for example, would be covered. Now, you could extend this to look at a mobile target like an aircraft carrier. I mean, the exercise can be done, but the coverage patterns are likely to be similar. So we are looking at a continuous surveillance capability over the region between 35 degrees north and 35 degrees south, which China has already put in place. It's an operational system. And with the supplementary SAR and electro-optical imagery, it can actually extend. Now, all this predominant capability, what does it do? It provides China with the basic information that it may need in order to make sure that if it does something over Taiwan, US intervention will likely to be problematic for the United States. Clearly, it's a part of what is known as their anti-access area denial strategy. I don't think there is any doubt about this aspect. So the other thing that you want to look at is when you look at so this is the first step. And obviously, China has got a lot of other things. It's got a navigation system. It's got communication military satellites, which are reasonably state of the art. The US is clearly ahead in all of them, but the Chinese are possibly the second largest or the second most capable of the space that we're talking about. And they've also got all these ASAT and BMD capabilities, which everybody's been talking about. So the weapon part is also demonstrated in various kinds of ways. And they are also doing all this hypersonic stuff. So it's a part of a larger architecture where space is going to come into forms. And therefore, one would assume that all this has got a purpose, and the purpose is a value chain. And it's not only about defining a weapon, it's also about defining a value chain and making sure that all parts of it are at least addressed. Okay, I mean, in a sense, therefore, I would therefore see it as a larger problem than just defining it narrowly in a legal sense as space weapon. I mean, there are also a lot of historical definitions of space weapon. I was involved in a UNIDAIR study about maybe 20 years ago, where we actually produced a working definition of a space weapon. I will send you the reference, maybe people can take a look at it. So clearly the definition that the Chinese and the Russians have put out is unacceptable in terms of totality. So clearly it is not something that we need to spend too much time on. It's a very narrow definition. It may not address all the problems that we would expect it to. So the other thing I would like to finish with just one other point. I recently did an assessment of the space capabilities of the US and China. The US has a number like 2,405 satellites in orbit, out of which 1,441, I think, belongs to one company, SpaceX, and Elon Musk has more satellites in orbit than China, India, Europe, France, etc., all put together. So it's a substantial capability. And the US has done, I think, 44 launches last year. The Chinese were ahead in the earlier years. So the US is now caught up, and the Chinese have, by comparison, maybe about 400 or 500 satellites. So the US has caught up with China. In the last ORR thing I presented, a relative thing. The US has not only caught up with China, it's also kind of become a bigger space, much bigger space. And I think the American initiatives are going to give it a lot of edge. So that is one aspect, which I think one needs to keep tabs of. The US is catching up, maybe even forging 10, and it's likely to forge 10. But given that, I still believe that China is the only possible contender. And what the China and the US will, what I call the rivalry or the lack of cooperation between China and the US, is going to dictate what is going to happen in the world. And therefore, just looking at a space weapon part alone without looking at the totality of the connectedness of space and its role and what, I tend to believe is not necessarily the most, what shall we say, elegant way to look at it.
Yeah. And thank you also for bringing up the point that the United States does continue to be the leader in developing counter-space capabilities, and it seems like everyone else is catching up, but that does seem to create a lot of instability for the wider wider community, the wider space community. I'm also just going to take this opportunity real quick to plug Secure World Foundation's Counterspace Capabilities Report. If anybody is interested in trends related to the development of technology, you can check the SWF website. We update it every year, and it's an excellent resource of publicly available information on what kinds of weapons are being developed and what we think they might be able to do. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We've already started talking about the Indo-Pacific region in particular here. So I'm going to pop over to Raji. Raji, you are an expert in the Indo-Pacific region. How do you see current geopolitical relations between the U.S. and China impacting the region, and not just the region, but also India's security perspective as well?
Thanks, Daniela. So India for a long time did not imagine that it would be developing counter-space capabilities. For instance, the January 2007 Chinese ASAT test was the wake-up call for India, which pushed India to think about the need to develop and demonstrate an appropriate capability as a deterrent mechanism in a sense. But even then, it took a dozen years to come up with a sort of a demonstrated capability. But I think that's also a reflection of the changing balance of power equations, both in the hard power capabilities, but also the traditional balance of power. One, this is a reflection of the increasing number of advanced military space programs in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And while most militaries around the world use space assets for a number of passive military applications like communication, intelligence gathering, but the trend towards weaponization in outer space is particularly worrying for India and a number of Indo-Pacific countries. Weaponization is, in some sense, is still a threshold that has not been crossed, but I think the global community needs to work together fast in order to prevent this. And I believe the great powers have a bigger responsibility in developing consensus so that they are able to frame new global norms to address this. On the counter-space capabilities itself, it's a major challenge, of course, in the space security realm. With more countries relying on outer space, the emphasis on counter-space capabilities has become something very, very critical in that sense. And this has begun to play out, particularly among the big three players in the space domain, US, China, and Russia. And from an Indian perspective or an Indo-Pacific perspective, what China does have a cascading effect with India, Japan, and the US and others following suit. And ASAT case is a case in point in a sense. The return to ASAT testing in 2007 after a gap of more than 2 decades, along with the growth of other counter-space capabilities, has made space a lot more competitive for the Indo-Pacific countries. And some of this, the result is that you have more countries, Japan, for instance, pushing the development of an interceptor capability. France is developing a different space strategy. Australia is developing sort of a space command of their own, in a sense, their own version of a space command. And I can think many more countries who are likely to go down this path, in a sense. So I think this is something that we need to keep in mind while China may be looking at the US as the ultimate in terms of the competition, but it does produce cascading effect, ripple effect in terms of producing, leading other countries to do similar things. And also relating to some of the points that came up earlier, the focus on technology is absolutely important, but I think we also need to look at the kind of behavior that we want to bring about restrictions on, the kind of behavior, the threatening behavior, the responsible and irresponsible behavior. And in this regard, I'm jumping a gun a little bit, but the open-ended working group work is going to be critical in this regard. And it's a pity that some of the few critical countries like India, including India, abstained from the recent vote because they felt that there could be subjective interpretations of responsible and irresponsible behavior and so on and so forth. I think that's something that really should not have been the case, because when looking at the previous GG effort and kind of things, where most countries agreed that it was time to move away from the technology-focused to behavioral approach, and still countries did not really sign on to approve the sort of vote for the recent vote of the UN GFS committee, and that was disappointing. A whole lot of 9 countries abstaining, and a few other countries voting no to the open-ended working group vote proposal. It was something disturbing in a sense, because I think we need to get going on that front also, because to me, space weapon, whether we defined by certain technologies or certain behavior, the final crux of the issue is going to be how we are able to frame new rules of the road to regulate that sector, which is the most challenging problem when it comes to space weaponization, in my mind.
Just to kind of catch everybody up, in case you're not very familiar with what's happening at the United Nations, the UK government has put forward a resolution trying to form an open-ended working group that will look at norms of behavior related to space security. And I can see that my other panelists are jumping out of their chairs to add some additional comments. Victoria.
Sure, thank you, Daniel. One of the things I find very interesting is when people talk about, space weapons and counter space capabilities and geopolitical competition, there obviously is an emphasis on the major competitors, U.S., China, to a lesser extent Russia, and those are obviously very concerning. We could have probably a whole conversation on that. But one of the points I wanted to make is in the Secure World Counter Space Threat document is that we look at 5 different counter space capabilities. We looked at direct ascent, i.e. using an interceptor directly to hit from the ground something in space. We look at rendezvous and proximity operations, getting up close and doing some sort of co-orbital capability of a counter space. But then, and those are the things I think most people think of, right? They think of the boom and the splash and, the fire, the explosions. Even though they don't really have this in space. But you know what I mean? They think weapons. But there are other things that are actually much more usable that a lot of countries have and that are also counter space capabilities. And those tend to get glossed over, but they're probably as threatening because they disrupt your access to space just the same as an interceptor or some sort of orbital approach. And those are things like radio frequency interference, electronic warfare, which is absolutely being done today. Things like directed energy weapons, lasers, that is a microwave, that sort of research is being done. And then also cyber attacks, which is kind of the dirty little secret for a lot of discussions on this, because it's kind of awkward. Like, how do we handle cyber capabilities? We don't really know, because that is a whole, it's kind of like space, but not really. But so it's complicated. And again, I'd like to emphasize that a lot of countries are looking into some or all of those capabilities. Raji talked about that in a little bit. And I just want to emphasize a lot of countries are looking into researching these capabilities, not necessarily for offensive purposes, but they are looking into it. And they're developing military space organizations, again, not necessarily because they want offensive capabilities, but because this apparently is the world we live in, and this is where countries are focusing their attention these days. So, just to keep, if there's one thing I want people to take away from this, it's a very complicated picture. And it's not just, if the U.S. and China gets their act together, we'll be good. No, there are absolutely other actors at play and other considerations. And we have to make sure if we really want a stable and predictable domain, we incorporate all those actors and all those considerations to be able to find some sort of solution to this. Thank you.
No, that's a great point, Victoria. We should always remember that, especially in the multilateral discussions, it's important to have as wide a participation as possible, not only because everybody has an interest in space systems, but also because everyone is starting to acquire some of this technology. And I'll go ahead and plug Raji. She did a great report for Unideer a couple of years ago on electronic warfare in space. So I highly recommend that everybody check out Space Dossier 3. Jessica, you also had a comment.
Well, I think Victoria's points are bang on, and so not all counter space capabilities go bang, but a lot of the things that are below the threshold of say the use of force, or what we might think of as a weapon, can escalate to the use of force, and things that do go bang in space. And so my own preference for thinking about how we improve security in space is to focus on governance. We're going to need many different tools and approaches to keep that potential escalation in check. And I love the way Professor Chandrasekhar was talking about a value chain. It's almost like there's, yes, a war-fighting value chain. And how do we manage the whole process so that we don't end up in a really nasty place at the end of the day? And I just really appreciated that framing, sort of an architecture and a value chain. It points to the fact that there's a lot of moving pieces that we have to be paying attention to, and that we need mechanisms and tools and understandings for, so that we don't end up going bang in space.
I couldn't agree more. Raji, you also wanted to have a follow-up.
Yeah, just a sort of a quick reiteration of the point about because of the heightened sense of competition and rivalry among the major space players, even peaceful technological developments for peaceful applications such as satellite inspection, refueling, repair, broadly called the on-orbit satellite servicing technologies, or the technologies to clean up space junk, are also seen with a lot of suspicion. So that's going to be the part of the problem in a sense, because if you have the technology to clean up clear space junk, the same technology can be used in a nefarious manner. That is going to be the concern. So unless you address some of the political problems that are driving some of these developments today, you are not going to go very far trying to define what a space weapon is, or even get some sort of an agreement on what are the kind of irresponsible behavior or threatening behavior and so on and so forth. So I think the political issues have to be addressed in a focused manner.
Professor Chandra, you wanted to...
See, I would like to... I spent a lot of my life looking at all these issues. Okay, I wasted 40, 50 years of my life looking at space. I've been associated, when I was with ISRO, we did a lot of work at the CD as well as at the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And in my opinion, as I see it, things have gotten from bad to worse. And a lot of the problems, as Raji pointed out, are political issues, and they are rivalry issues, right? And even amongst the democracies of the world, where apparently people have a significant say on what countries should do, I don't think these models of political governance and all are really working, right? So I believe that space is already a weaponized arena, right? And we are trying to limit something that has already been kind of unleashed. And therefore, the only way in which we can rein in some of these things is like the non-proliferation treaty, where you say others cannot get in, but we are the big 5 or the big 10, and we will do what we want. Or you go around, trying to keep on talking about the same thing over and over again, right? I believe that space is already an arena where weapons are already in place. And unfortunately, the problem with space is that it has become integral to modern warfare and modern deterrence. And therefore, I do not see this problem as easily going away. It does not have, as Raji said, a technical solution to the problem, although technical definitions can sometimes help, but we need the political will, right? And I believe that there is a complete absence of political will in a world which is no longer a bipolar world, but a kind of multipolar, oligopoly kind of structure of the world today. And therefore, I am very, I'm very skeptic about the ability of the international community to actually get together, to be able to come up with a workable framework, especially when the number of players in the space arena are increasing, and they're becoming larger now. And while I agree that I think it would be great if we have a space that does not have any weapons, I'm not sure whether we will ever get it. And I'm talking from 40 years of experience in all this stuff, 40 years. I mean, I've been seeing the same treaty in the CD for the last, 40 years, 35 years.
It's been 40 years, my entire lifetime, that we've been trying to achieve something and still haven't managed to pull anything off. But, sir, you make a great point about political will. It seems like, especially in the Conference on Disarmament, we continually punt the ball into the long grass. And so I guess I would look to all of you and sort of raise the question, and I know everyone's got follow-ups here as well to some of these very provocative comments, and we're all getting lots of good ideas, but what is it going to take to achieve that political will to finally get some kind of space arms control? Is it going to require an accident, a disaster, an escalatory emergency of some sort? What do we need? Is it something else? Let's start with Victoria.
Thanks, Daniel. And I agree with Professor Chandra. I mean, this has been a very theoretical discussion for the past couple decades. Like, yeah, we don't want to have an arms race in outer space. Things are going bad. But it was just kind of, okay, well, we'll get to it when we get to it. In the meantime, we have the gumming up of the Conference of Disarmament, where really there was no accomplishments being done in terms of moving ahead on these discussions for the past couple decades. But I will say I'm cautiously optimistic about possibly getting some forward momentum now, just because things have started to shift in the past couple of years. Instead of having the same discussions about the PPWT that we've been having since 2008 and going nowhere on. And frankly, I blame the West for that as much as the East, just because the United States kept saying that they didn't like the PPWT, but not really offering an alternative. And that's where you go back to Professor Chandra's point about needing political leadership. There was not any kind of political leadership for that. But over the past couple of years, we've started to see that. We've mentioned a couple times already the UK Resolution 75/36 from last December, which called for countries to submit to the UN Secretary General, their ideas of what they think of the biggest threats to space security and stability. What do they identify as responsible behavior in space? And what do they want to move forward on? Because there's been a disconnect into even what the biggest threat is. And if you cannot figure out what the threat is, there's no way you're going to solve that problem. And so I think that's been helpful to redirect the conversation away from, as we said, the same arguments, how do you define a space weapon, how to go with that. Well, let's putting the technology aside, what sort of behavior do we find threatening? Just because it's not so much the technology, but truly it's the intent and the behavior and the actions is how you determine that intent. And then again, there's another resolution, as was indicated, that is in process and hopefully will be finalized by the GA next month, that will create an open-ended working group that will attempt to answer some of those questions that were raised. And the reason why, and I know everyone has a lot to say, so I'll stop after this, but the reason why I'm optimistic is that if you look through the country submissions to the Secretary General about what they see the biggest threats and what they identify as responsible behavior, some commonalities arise. And, it seems to be gelling around the idea that the deliberate creation of long-lived debris is a bad idea. We don't want that. Okay, that's good. We can work with that. There's a common understanding that non-consensual close approaches are a bad idea. Okay, great, that works. You have to act with due regard, no harmful interference. And you have that showing up that. And then the last point I'll make is that over the summer, the U.S. Secretary of Defense put out a memo calling for norms of behavior in space. And lo and behold, those ideas were encapsulated in that memo. So I think we're actually having slow but actual tangible progress. And I'm really hopeful we'll get something out of this OEWG, the Open-Ended Working Group, that will allow us to break out this morass and get some accomplishments in the future and get space to be more secure and stable. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Usually I'm the optimist and you're the much more practical one. And so the fact that you're optimistic really makes me feel good about this process. Jessica, what do you think?
I share Victoria's optimism. I'm going to flip sides for a minute and just briefly overview why a few states voted against the process. Obviously, some of it is politically driven. There's competition for leadership, which is great. More people wanting to lead is always good. But some specific concerns with the upcoming working group and the focus on norms of behavior were that it wasn't specifically focused on weapons, not sufficiently focused on an arms race, and not sufficiently legal. And I actually think that those are complaints and concerns that can be addressed through behavioral norms of behavior if we take the right approach in the working group going forward, where you can draw specific linkages between technology and actions. And I think one way to do that would be to focus on testing. And there's a lot of support for having some sort of test ban treaty on kinetic weapons that would create long-term debris. And while that doesn't ban a weapon per se, if states are prevented from testing their capabilities, then it's really difficult to produce the kind of accurate, adequate weapons capability in the first place. And so I think that's an example where you can have behavioral measures that also constrain hardware. And we've done that on nuclear as well. I mean, that's a driving logic behind not having nuclear weapons tests, so that you're not continually developing new weapons capabilities. So I think there's optimism that we can also address some of the criticisms that the focus on arms generated among political statements if we choose the right things to focus on going forward.
Thanks, Jessica. And that's a great subject matter as well that perhaps the OEWG can be looking at. The testing of anti-satellite weapons, as we've seen in recent years, can leave debris all across, in particular, low Earth orbit. And I believe the International Space Station actually just had to do a maneuver because of a potential close contact with a piece of debris from the 2007 Chinese ASAT test. And so we know that, any type of testing, including the one we saw in 2019 from India, it can create a lot of problems for everyone's satellites that happen to be in those orbits. Professor Chandra, you wanted to follow up?
See, I have a slightly different perspective on what both Victoria and Jessica are saying. I think a lot of the stability that we saw in space, where all the things happened, was basically because of the structure of the geopolitical power of the world at that time. We had only two major players, and whenever they felt that they didn't want to push the envelope when they have already tested or done something and they didn't want others to do it, they agreed. And then they came up with various requirements of legal regimes that other countries had to comply with. For example, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which bans nuclear weapon tests in space, came about because I think both the Russians, both the Soviets and the Americans tested megaton weapons in space, and a lot of satellites got destroyed in the process. And after that, both people felt that we should ban nuclear tests in outer space. So my point is, therefore, the power structure of the world at that time was favorable towards stability, and I would argue a sanctuary kind of regime. Whereas fundamentally, what I see today is the world is no longer, two great powers and a number of other irrelevant powers. The world is today maybe one very big power, another rising power, and a lot of medium power countries. And each one of them have different kinds of interests. And therefore, the political aspect of the world structure and how it impacts the conduct of nations is going to be a major factor. And I do not believe that it's easy for us to negotiate through this maze of stuff in order to come up with a reasonable framework for doing it. I think unless and until some of the bigger powers decide that enough is enough, and that they will necessarily push the other people into compliance, I think this is not going to happen. And given what's happening between between China and the United States, I do not believe that these things are going to happen, at least in the next, decade.
That's interesting, and perhaps the way to really achieve some meaningful arms control is trilateral or quadrilateral, some kind of plurilateral discussion between some of the major space powers that are pursuing these capabilities. But unfortunately, I think what we've seen from current geopolitical context is that trust is at an all-time low, and many of these countries are having difficulties even coming to the table, let alone trying to tackle some of these big challenges. Raji, what do you think about this?
So, yeah, I agree with Chandra's point, and I think this is something that we have talked about so much in terms of how the earlier decades, the treaty developing exercise was such an easy one, given in relative terms, because you had two major powers who had to work out, and they had an inherent interest in making sure that the technology did not spread to a large number of countries. But today, the scenario is completely different. You have about 80 countries, 80 players active in space, and different kind of stakeholders. Private industry, commercial actors are important stakeholder. You have educational institutions and others. So the number of actors as well as the diversity of actors involved in the space domain itself is a major challenge in kind of bringing about an agreement among all of these powers. But I think the other issue is, of course, the geopolitics, and therefore it is primarily still driven by two or three major powers in a sense, and they are others are kind of latching onto these two or three powers in a sense. So if you are able to thrash out some sort of an agreement among the top 3 powers, 4 powers, I think you still maybe. But I think the developing a legally binding mechanism is still a long way, precisely because of what you said, the trust issue. Trust has become such a victim in the current geopolitical competition, and therefore, at least as a first step, we need to start with political agreements to precisely address the political hindrances that are coming in the way, the trust issue, confidence in each other, and so on and so forth. But one quick word on the whole NPT-like mechanism. NPT-like mechanism may not work in space because space is such a dual-use item and dual-use technology, and therefore we need to look at more like a biological weapons convention kind of mechanism rather than an NPT-like mechanism that may not really work. So that's my other just point that I wanted to kind of comment on quickly.
Well, there are also some really great points, Raji. Victoria, you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button. So this is exciting because I'm a political scientist and I cut my teeth in discussing bipolar versus multipolar world. So let's get into it. I think absolutely, things have changed since the Cold War, where you had the concern about, thermonuclear war keeping things from getting too hot and, pressing down almost equally on each side. And when that pressure was taken off, then a lot of other things were allowed to bubble up that had been held back. And so it is a more complicated world, absolutely. But I don't think we want to go back to where it was before. Yeah. And so trying to figure out, okay, how do we handle these new balances of power with, different regional hubs and different geopolitical considerations? I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. One of the things I find very interesting when looking at space security and stability is that, as we say, the Cold War was really the United States versus the Soviet Union, but looking at, strengths in space now, it's really US and China, with Russia really having issues. Russia has no real commercial space program to speak of, and that's really where a lot of the trends are for space capabilities, is going towards commercial space, as we see with the rise of the mega constellations. Russia's civil space program has had a lot of corruption and quality control issues, to say the least. They actually spun the space station earlier this year because of some issues with docking. And so security space is where they still have the option to contribute and be a major player. And so I think oftentimes that is overlooked when looking at concerns for, geopolitical considerations. And the other thing is that I think oftentimes in these discussions, and again, I don't want to downplay the importance of the major geopolitical rivals and finding some sort of solution for this. But, space security and stability is relevant to everyone. Everyone on this planet is a user of space data, whether or not your country has satellites, whether or not your country has a space agency, whether or not any of those things. And I always point to the idea of Ecuador. They launched their satellite about a decade ago, and within about a month, it was taken out by a piece of space debris. They had nothing to do with it, but they were still affected by the domain. And I think oftentimes a lot of countries have been happy, frankly, to allow the major geopolitical powers to take on the responsibility of this conversation. And, that's not a good way to handle it. We want to make sure that everyone is involved because everyone has a stake. And you don't want to repeat the problems we had with, like, for example, the EU Code of Conduct, where they basically did not incorporate the interests and needs and concerns of the rest of the world. And frankly, it failed. And it's been on, I shouldn't say failed, it's been on life support since 2015. I really want this to work. And I think in order to do that, we need to make sure all the major players are involved in this and that there's an opportunity for input by all stakeholders. Thank you.
Oh, you had to bring up the code of conduct, didn't you?
This just can't stop.
Because that's one of the first times that we really tried to push hard for some norms of behavior in space at a multilateral level, and we saw that oftentimes diplomacy plays a really big role. And in that sense, I would like to commend Ambassador Little from the UK, who I thought has kicked off an incredible campaign to try and bring in as many actors as they can and to make sure that this open-ended working group has a lot of buy-in. We are coming up to our time here, so I'm just going to go through with a quick round of final comments. Jessica, let's start with you.
Yeah, I was actually going to channel my inner Victoria and say, space security is everyone's responsibility, and all states have a responsibility to push the ones with the technical capabilities to the table and to say, this is not acceptable. Here's what we want to see. Space is too important, not just for you, but for me. And I'm, as much as we see it as being more politically difficult in a multipolar world, this is how the most recent arms control agreements have been struck since the end of the Cold War. They've been multilateral processes. They have been led by civil society, small and medium countries banding together in common interest and pushing the envelope. And I think what we see now is a gentle pushing of the envelope, an invitation maybe to bring countries around the table and talk about their mutual interests. And I don't see why that process can't also work in space, just because it's not being led necessarily by the big states. As long as we can get them at the table and have conversation and keep up the pressure, we have to do something on this issue. Space really is too important to continue to punt it to future generations, and it's too important for small countries, even my own, such as Canada, to sit on the sidelines and wait and see what the big states do. We have to be active on this issue. Every country has a voice.
Thank you, Jessica. Professor Chandra.
I think we need a way out of this, what I call this bottleneck, right, of politically driven agendas. I have great belief in the commercial sector. I believe that what you see happening in the world today is a major push by a lot of private companies in order to kind of make space much more accessible to the world community. I believe it's a very positive step. And I believe some of the problems that we are seeing in terms of the power balance that we're talking about, if you could harness some of this power to look at cooperative endeavors, economics and money making definitely favors cooperation much more than maybe geopolitics today. So that's one way to really change the way in which we are looking at the forces that are shaping the evolution of a space regime. The other thing I believe is the fundamental pressure that people can bring to bear upon governments. I see a total absence of major people power in any of the democracies of the world. And I believe that maybe one other way to look at it is to make it some kind of a, I don't know if it's a democracy, an election issue, if it's not a democracy, an issue of concern to a large segment of the population. The world comes in several political formats, but in each one, maybe we need to do an adaptation. So I believe that unless we can alter some of the current status quo rigidification of the world, the geopolitical order, these things are not going to happen easily. So I believe that, maybe economic cooperation, company to company level cooperation, globalization through economic means, maybe, or maybe the democratic roots putting pressure on governments to make a change in the way they look at the world. I think these are requirements maybe that we need to go back a little bit to examining the structural foundations of how countries govern themselves and then present themselves as players in the international forum. I think that's one way to look at it. I am very skeptical about the political way of resolving it.
Well, let's hope that excuse me. Let's hope that economic development will drive some of the political leaders to see that this is, as Jessica, is just an issue that is way too important to keep punting into the long grass, and that they need to start taking action, even if it's small action, measured, realistic, tangible action. But it needs to be something. Raji, why don't you give us some closing remarks?
Yeah, just a very quick thought. I would say that I think we need to start focusing first and foremost on the norms of responsible behavior, because what we are seeing with the recent developments over the last decade or so is the erosion of norms that prevailed for several decades. Many aspects of space governance norms, it's as good as the norms are as good as the rules, and norms are and therefore we could start with something like non-testing of ASAT, for instance, which was a norm that prevailed for a long time. But there was no rule against the ASAT testing, and violation of that norm now today has meant that we are facing serious difficulties. Similarly, norm against interference in each other's satellite operations, again something that prevailed for a while but is increasingly being violated, and this is a slippery slope that we need to avoid unless we want to move towards dangerous destinations. And therefore, this is important, norms of responsible behavior. And we also need to start looking at small technical agreements rather than all-encompassing, comprehensive sort of agreement, legally binding mechanism. As at least the first step should be towards looking at political agreements that would tackle smaller aspects of the space weaponization issues.
Thank you, Raji. I think that's an excellent way to close up. And might I also add, that's a fantastic photo of your mom in the background. Beautiful smile.
Thank you.
Folks, thank you so much for joining us. We've run out of time, unfortunately. And of course, all of these great experts have lots more information that you can go and look up. I in particular would encourage everyone to follow all of these experts on the Twitter. Victoria, Raji, and Jessica actually are some of my sources for tons of great information, and I would invite y'all to do the same and benefit from all of their comments. So with that, I think we're going to close it out. This is the 6th annual Kalpana Chawla Space Dialogue. I think I've participated in every single one, and it's always one of the highlights of my year. So thank you for joining us, everyone, and hopefully we'll see y'all in person soon.